widespread copyright infringement is like a generational shift of cultural values and ignorance of existing law, similar to massive experimentation with illegal drugs in the 1960s.
Hi, I'm Anthony Fisher for Reason TV, and I'm with Stephen Witt, the author of How Music Got Free, The End of an Industry, The Turn of the Century, and The Patient Zero of Piracy. It's the definitive history of the creative disruption that ended the era of recorded music as an expensive physical commodity and brought us to the reality we have today. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the MP3 itself. Music couldn't become free without the right medium to deliver it, and the MP3 was kind of the Goldilocks format for that. It was high quality enough that most listeners couldn't tell the difference between it and a CD, and it was small enough that it wouldn't eat up all the space on your hard drive. Can you talk a little bit about the development of the MP3?
The music industry is often criticized for their mishandling of the digital era, but it's not quite true. They were the first industry to go completely digital, and they did it in 1982 with the introduction of the compact disc. Now, at that time, there was a group of kind of, offbeat German scientists who looked at the compact disc and said, well, geez, it's all digital, it's all there. Rather than selling physical media, why don't we just put it all on a computer? So they really had to shrink it a lot if they were going to do that. And by 88 or 89, they actually had a working prototype of this, something that deleted more than 90% of the information on a compact disc, and as you said, was still relatively listenable. The problem was that this was a very competitive space, and they were locked in a format war with someone else called the MP2, which was actually an inferior technology but had the backing of bigger corporate players. So in desperation, they took this thing and they posted online on a website for public download for free.
So they gave away the technology.
They gave away the technology. Well, guess what happened? A bunch of teenage kids found this and were like, shoot, can you imagine what we can do with this? So a bunch of teenagers in their mom's basement started using this to pirate files. Soon enough, of course, people were coming to college campuses. Bandwidth was increasing very rapidly, both consumer bandwidth and then especially in the universities. And by 97 or 98, they'd moved from singles to full albums. As the number of files in existence began to grow, Brandenburg actually made a ton of money, not from selling to consumers, but from selling to businesses. So he could go to Windows and say, hey, you want to build an MP3 player in Windows, you got to license it from me. By 99 or 2000, every single computer that's shipped in the world with Windows installed on it, he got a cut.
You wrote in the book that without the incentives of software patent revenue, no one would have even bothered to develop the MP3. And yet the guys who created the MP3 have totally rejected the idea of piracy on both moral and practical terms. Can you talk a little bit about that?
They're essentially hypocritical, what they're saying. I'm not afraid to say that. And they wouldn't like that, but there's no denying that their intellectual property fortune is based on the greatest wave of copyright infringement that the world has ever seen. Now, I agree with some extent to their point. It costs tens of millions of dollars and thousands upon thousands of man-hours to develop this thing. They had to do thousands upon thousands of hours of listening tests. So people sitting there in a sound booth with an expensive pair of headphones on, listening to the same audio snippet pass through the audio filter over and over and over and over again. Their famous sample that they used many, many, many times was the opening bars to Tom's Diner by Suzanne Vega. They
earned their money, is what you're saying.
Karl-Heinz Brandenburg has listened to that audio snippet upwards of 10,000 times in his life. So he earned it. And someone had to do that work. And it is work. It's not the kind of thing that you do without getting paid for it to some extent. So their point is we never would have developed this without the prospect of patent revenue on the horizon. Maybe they would have, though.
So you also wrote that the music industry wouldn't license the technology, the MP3 technology, without a critical mass of MP3 players. And the electronics industry wouldn't manufacture the players without a critical mass of MP3s.
Right.
You also talked about how the record industry won the Napster case. They were able to shut down the first big, ubiquitous pirating service, but they lost a case called RIAA versus Diamond, which essentially legalized the MP3 player.
After the debut of Napster in 99, 2000, 2001, you suddenly had hundreds and hundreds of, maybe millions of these things floating around on computers around the world, and no way to easily get them off. So Napster was responsible, at least initially, for making that happen. And eventually they were sued out of existence by, as you say, the recording industry. The recording industry, as you say, also filed a second lawsuit against the earliest MP3 players. In that lawsuit they lost. The judge said, well, I can't tell the difference between an MP3 player and just a hard drive, so really you can't determine who can buy or sell these things or what they're used for.
And this was crucial because Napster existed during the period in the late 90s when people would just listen to their MP3s on their computer. Now they could take them with them.
This was critical because before that the MP3 was still an inferior good to the compact disc. The real problem was that the MP3s on your computer, as you say, were stranded. You couldn't take them to the park, you couldn't DJ a party with them, you couldn't take them in your car very easily. So they were kind of a stranded good. What was needed basically was something to liberate them, and I think you know where I'm going with this. In the book, I compare the widespread copyright infringement as like a generational shift of cultural values and ignorance of existing law, similar to massive experimentation with illegal drugs in the 1960s. That's what piracy was to the millennial crowd. If that's the case, if that analogy holds, then what Apple did was they invented the vaporizer. Okay, they were selling pickaxes during a gold rush. The MP3 player was what really made these things valuable, the iPod in particular. And this turned Apple from a third-rate technology player that was 1/30th the size of Microsoft into the largest company on earth. One more point that's interesting there is we live in the mobile era, right? We now have tremendous developments in mobile computing. You can trace what's happening today on your smartphone back to Napster.
I'd like to pivot a little into the record industry, which kind of was asleep at the wheel, had engaged in collusion against its customers, was charging $18 a CD even as the technology was slowly becoming obsolete. You focus on Doug Morris, who was one of the big music executives, had kind of cornered the market on popular hip hop. Can you talk a little bit about him and how much responsibility he personally bears for not adjusting to the realities of the changing business?
So Morris was the classic record industry guy, and he got the talent totally right, but he never thought about distribution. The paradigm shift that they missed, as I put it in my book, they were looking at those racks of compact discs at the mall, and they thought of those as inventory. But to a computer engineer, they weren't inventory. They were just an array of inefficiently stored data. The computer engineers saw it like the Germans did. They should all be on one computer with people licensing and accessing as needed. Well, the record industry wouldn't let them do that. They wouldn't give them the rights to do that, no matter how many engineers said that to them. So what happened instead is a bunch of teenagers built it illegally underground, and that became the distribution mechanism for music in the late 90s and early 2000s.
For me, the most compelling kind of story within a story was about Del Glover, who was basically the most prolific leaker of all time.
So these guys who went and very early pirated the first MP3s and put them on floppy disks and mailed them around were part of an underground subculture on the internet that goes back to the early 1980s. And this is called the wares scene, or usually just the scene. And what these guys do is they create kind of loosely affiliated digital gangs that infiltrate the supply chains of the software industry and the music and movie industry, get stuff from them and leak it out to the internet, and they race each other to do this. So it's essentially they're doing it for cred. They get no money for doing this. Del Glover was a worker at the packaging line in a compact disc factory in North Carolina. So his job was to take the compact discs, and he was paid about $10 an hour to take the compact discs and feed them into a shrink wrapper. Okay? So not the most glamorous job in the world. However, what this meant was that he, and really he alone, had access to the finished discs, the finished product, before it entered inventory, but after it was actually pressed. Over the course of 7 years, Del and his confederates leaked 2,000 first-run CDs out of the plant, comprising almost all of the hits of the era. They leaked Eminem, they leaked Kanye West, they leaked U2, they leaked Nickelback, they leaked 50 Cent, they leaked everything. As fast as Doug Morris, who had cornered the market on rap music upstairs, could sign a band, Del Glover, who also worked for Universal Music Group, would leak it. If you pirated music during this period in the 2000s, or even if you just have some music on your hard drive and you're not really sure how it got there, it almost certainly passed through Del Glover's hands.
What do you think of the new normal of music that's free and ubiquitous? Is it moral, and was it always inevitable?
It was inevitable. They were doomed, and not because of piracy. But the biggest risk was the disaggregation of the single from the album. That's what really, really hurt them, and they all know it. For years, they'd been selling songs that nobody really wanted to hear. And that was especially true with rap music. Rap music is totally singles driven. I mean, there's some good rap albums, but there's not a lot. It's really a singles format. So if that's what you're selling and the consumer has the option to just buy one song versus 14, they will buy one song. So the old A&R is essentially obsolete. He's a data analyst now. They can see exactly what people are listening to, when, and how. And that makes the album essentially obsolete. It makes it dead. They can no longer sell it for the prices they used to. Publishing now is facing this problem. Tons of books get sold that don't get read. Ambitious biographies of historical figures. Thomas Piketty's Capital was a bestseller, the #1 bestseller in the country. But the average reader probably didn't make it past page 25 or 26. So the publishing industry is enjoying this massive deadweight loss, selling people words that they're not going to read. Bezos and the Kindle allows you to track exactly what words people are reading. And this is a huge risk for the publishing industry, and especially for authors like me. I'm enjoying the money from this. A lot of people buy my book or get it as a gift, and they never even open it, but I still get paid. If they can track who's reading what precisely, that would be an economic catastrophe for me and for the publishing industry as well. And that's what happened to music.
Okay, thanks so much for talking to us. Stephen Witt, the author of How Music Got Free, The End of an Industry, The Turn of the Century, and The Patient Zero of Piracy. For Reason TV, I'm Anthony Fisher.